Sometimes trust doesn't go away. She just hides behind the noise. Imagine a lake at dawn. The surface is smooth, almost motionless. Nothing forces the water to remain calm. It simply is. But all it takes is a stone, an impatient wind, a hurried step on the shore, and what has always been peaceful seems to be lost. This also happens within us. There are days when the body wakes up tense, as if something is about to go wrong, even when nothing has happened. The heart races for no clear reason. The mind anticipates scenarios, creates defenses, builds invisible walls, and little by little, we enter a silent state of distrust of life. But what if trust wasn't something we needed to build? What if it was a natural state that we just forgot how to access? The spiritual tradition that arises from intimate contact with nature has always known this. She never treated confidence as wishful thinking, nor as forced affirmation. Trust on this path is alignment. This is when the body stops resisting, when the mind stops fighting what is, when something invisible but deeply familiar rearranges itself within us. There is an old phrase, simple and silent, that doesn't try to convince the brain of anything. She doesn't argue with fear. Don't argue with doubt. She just points the way back, like a dirt path that was always there, even when we got lost in the forest. When this phrase is welcomed with presence, something curious happens. Breathing changes before thinking. The shoulders drop. The internal gaze softens. It's as if the body recognizes, I can rest here. This is not blind faith. It's about bodily remembrance, from a trust that does not depend on external guarantees, because it is born from the deep feeling of being in agreement with the invisible flow of life. If you feel that there is something inside you that is tired of always being on alert, if some part of you longs for a place inside where you can rest without guilt, so stay with me in this video, because maybe the confidence you're looking for isn't in the future or in control, or in loud responses. Perhaps it will awaken at the exact moment you allow yourself to hear the oldest whisper of silence. Breathe. Something is being remembered. We live as if something is always about to happen. Even in moments of rest, the body does not rest completely. The mind remains vigilant, scrolling through possibilities, anticipating losses, rehearsing answers to questions that have not yet been asked. It's as if a deep part of us has forgotten what it's like to be safe without explanation. The modern world has trained us to do this. He trained our eyes to look for danger, our hands to control, our mind to anticipate. We call this prudence, responsibility, maturity. But in the silence, the body reveals something else. Tiredness. An old tiredness, which does not come from physical effort, but from the constant tension of needing to be prepared for everything. When fear becomes a habit, it stops being felt as fear. It becomes the permanent background of the experience. Breathing becomes short, the chest slightly closed, the jaw almost always contracted, and the internal system learns to live as if the world were, by default, a hostile place. This state is not born of evil. It arises from the attempt to protect. The human body is wise. When it perceives uncertainty, it activates its alarms. But the problem arises when uncertainty stops being the exception and becomes the constant climate of life. The alarm never turns off, and what should protect us begins, silently, to wear us down. Spirituality that observes nature realizes something simple. No animal lives on alert all the time. Even the most attentive people know when to let their guard down. There is a rhythm, a pulsation between wakefulness and rest, between attention and delivery. Modern humans, however, have broken this cycle. We try to control the future like someone trying to hold water in their hands. The more we squeeze, the more it flows. And the more it flows, the more force we apply. This is how anxiety is born, not as weakness, but as excess effort against the natural flow of things. In this state, trust seems naive, almost dangerous. Trust, to the tense mind, sounds like lowering defenses on a battlefield. But this happens because we confuse confidence with carelessness. True confidence is not the absence of perception. It is presence without rigidity. It does not deny impermanence. She accepts it, and by accepting, the body stops fighting against the inevitable. There is deep within each of us a memory older than fear, a memory of when the world was felt as an extension of one's own body, when life didn't need to be won, just lived. This memory is not accessed by arguments, not even for long analyses. It opens when the body recognizes a signal of permission, an internal gesture that says, "You can let go a little now." This is why certain words, when born from certain silence, do not they inform it. They reorganize it. They don't ask for effort. They remove the excess. Before any external change, before any important decision, before even understanding intellectually, the path begins when the alert state learns, again, to rest without fear. And when that happens, something invisible begins to align. Trust is not born of thought. It rises from the ground. Look at an ancient tree. She doesn't wake up wondering if the wind will be too strong. It doesn't calculate probabilities before launching its branches into the sky. It simply grows, because growing is its nature. The stability we see in her does not come from rigidity, but from rootedness. The deeper the roots, the less need there is to resist. The trunk can move. The branches can dance. The tree trusts because it belongs. Human beings also belong. But somewhere along the way, he forgot that. We learn to believe that we need to earn the right to be safe, that we can only relax after resolving everything. That trust comes as a reward, never as a starting point. And so we spend our lives postponing rest, as if it depended on a flawless future. But true trust is not a prize. It is a basal state. Before any personal story, before disappointments, before losses, even before words, the body knew. A baby doesn't trust because it understands the world. He trusts because he feels support. Sit arms, feel hot, feel presence. This memory does not disappear. It just gets buried under layers of surveillance. When we talk about spiritual confidence, we are not talking about believing that everything will work out. We are talking about something more subtle, the internal feeling that even when something goes wrong, you are still whole. This is why confidence does not eliminate fear. She surrounds him. How the mountain envelops the fog. The fog may cover everything, but the mountain is still there, motionless, silent. Those who trust do not demand total clarity. It remains. There is a form of trust that does not depend on answers. It manifests as a bodily yes to life as it is now, even imperfect, even uncertain, even in transition. When this yes happens, something changes in the internal posture. The weight of the world seems better distributed. It doesn't disappear, but it stops crushing. This confidence doesn't shout. She doesn't assert herself. She doesn't try to convince anyone. It just sustains. Therefore, trying to think positively almost never works. Because trust does not live in the layer of thought. It lives below, where the body decides whether to fight or rest. The spiritual path that listens to nature has always pointed to this: returning to the simple, back to the essentials. Return to what does not need to be proven. Trust, in this sense, is remembering that you are not separate from the larger movement, that the same principle that turns night into morning also operates silently in your life. Nothing needs to be forced for the sun to rise. Nothing needs to be controlled for the water to meet the sea. When this understanding stops being an idea and begins to be felt, confidence returns not as euphoria, but as solid ground under one's feet. And it is exactly at this point that a simple, old and silent phrase can touch the body and awaken what has always been waiting to be remembered. And when that happens, the path opens without haste. There is a moment on the path when we don't need any further explanations. The mind has already understood enough. What's missing isn't clarity, it's gentle surrender. The spiritual tradition that arises from contact with the cycles of nature has never treated words as magical formulas. They are not used to convince the world. They serve to align the heart. Therefore, the sentence that awakens trust is not long. It's not complex. And it doesn't require effort. It arises from the intimate relationship between the human and the invisible, between that which breathes and that which silently sustains the breath. The phrase is, Kami no mani mani. Don't repeat it hastily. Don't turn it into noise. Feel it first. Kami does not point to a distant god. It points to the living forces that inhabit everything, the wind that changes direction, the water that finds unlikely paths, the time that matures what we still don't understand. Mani means something like, according to the flow, in the manner of, in harmony with. Together, these words do not say everything will be fine. They say something deeper. I align with the larger movement. When this phrase is received internally, it does not act as a command, acts as permission. Permission to stop resisting. Permission not to know. Permission not to control every development. It does not ask you to trust the result. It invites you to trust the process, and that changes everything. When repeating Kami no Mani silently, do not try to believe it. Just let the body listen to you. Perhaps your breathing becomes longer, without you noticing. Maybe the weight on your shoulders will lessen a few millimeters. Maybe nothing will happen right away, and that also makes part. This phrase does not act on the surface. She goes down, like water that infiltrates the earth slowly, without haste, without violence, until it finds the point where it can rest. On the spiritual path, it is said that true purification is not removing something, but returning everything to its natural place. Fear becomes just a sign again. Thought becomes just a tool again, and trust takes center stage again. Kami no Mani is not said to ward off fear. It is said so that fear no longer needs to scream. It reminds the body that it is not alone, that there is a greater rhythm supporting the next step, even when it is not yet visible. If this phrase resonates with you, it's not because you chose it, it's because something inside was already ready to hear it. And when this happens, trust stops being a distant ideal and begins to manifest itself as a simple, everyday silent gesture, a gesture of agreement with life as it presents itself now. And when this gesture happens, the body recognizes the path. When the phrase is welcomed in silence and repeated gently, something begins to change before the mind even realizes it. It is not a dramatic or immediate change, but a subtle displacement of the internal axis. The body, which lived slightly projected into the future, begins to return to the now. Breathing reorganizes, itself becoming deeper, more spaced out, as if finding again a rhythm that it has always known. The thoughts continue to arise, but they begin to have more space between them, like clouds that move away and leave gaps in the sky. This is one of the clearest signs that confidence is not a mental concept, but a physiological and perceptual state. When repeating Kami no Mani, the body does not understand words. He understands intention. He recognizes the gesture of alignment, the silent decision to stop fighting the flow of experience. And when the fight stops even for a moment, the internal system leaves defense mode and enters a state of vigilant, calm, awake rest. In this state, perception changes. External situations remain the same, but the way they are felt changes. What previously seemed like a threat begins to be seen as movement. What seemed like pressure starts to be understood as a passage, not because everything has become easy, but because the body is no longer contracted trying to predict each step. The phrase acts as a continuous reminder that it is not necessary to carry the entire world on your shoulders. Many people describe this feeling as if something is supporting them from below, as if the ground was firmer. It's not euphoria nor artificial enthusiasm. It is a discreet, almost humble serenity that allows you to go through the moment without needing to dominate it. The mind, realizing that it doesn't need to solve everything now, relaxes its impulse to control. And in this relaxation, clearer answers emerge, less reactive decisions, simpler actions. The confidence activated by this phrase does not eliminate uncertainty. On the contrary, it creates space for uncertainty to exist without generating panic. Life remains unpredictable, but the body stops interpreting this as a constant threat. It's like being on a river, and instead of fighting the current or trying to anticipate every turn, allowing yourself to float along mindfully, feeling the direction, adjusting as necessary. Over time, this practice changes the relationship with one's own thinking. Internal stories lose some of their capturing power. Fear may arise, but it does not settle as a command. He becomes just a visitor. The sentence does not expel him. Just remember that he is not the center. The center returns to being the flow, the greater movement that includes fear, but is not reduced to it. It is at this point that many realize something important. Trust does not mean knowing what will happen. but feeling that whatever happens there is an internal capacity to overcome. The phrase does not promise absolute protection. It awakens belonging. And this belonging changes the way the world is lived. Life stops being a constant battlefield and becomes a path that reveals itself step by step, supported by something greater than individual effort. When this perception stabilizes, even if intermittently, trust stops being a distant ideal and becomes a concrete experience, felt in the body, in the rhythm of breathing, and in the way in which the present is inhabited. This is how the phrase fulfills its deepest function, not by changing external reality, but by reorganizing the way you walk within it. Over time, the phrase stops being an isolated moment of practice and begins to infiltrate everyday life. It appears not only in moments of silence, but exactly when life gets tough. It appears before a difficult decision, in the middle of a tense conversation, or at that moment of the night when the mind insists on revisiting everything that has not yet been resolved. At these points, it does not come as a ready answer, but as an internal, almost imperceptible adjustment, which it changes the way you face the situation. In important decisions, for example, the sentence does not point the correct path like a light sign. What it does is reduce noise. By repeating, kami no manamani, the body stops operating exclusively from the fear of making mistakes and starts listening to deeper layers of perception. The urgency decreases, the need to choose quickly dissolves, and in this broader space, the decision emerges in a more organic way, less reactive, more aligned with what can really be sustained in the long term. In moments of anxiety, the phrase works as an anchor, not in the sense of arresting, but of stabilizing. When the mind starts racing to future scenarios, it brings it back to the present moment. It doesn't force the thought to stop, it just slows it down. Little by little, the body understands that it doesn't need to resolve everything now to be safe. This bodily understanding is more effective than any rational argument, because it acts where anxiety really arises. There are also situations in which the feeling is of being lost, without clarity about the next step. In these moments, the phrase does not return maps, but it restores confidence in walking. She remembers that the entire path does not need to be visible for the next step to be taken. Just as in nature, it is often movement that reveals the trail, not the other way around. By aligning oneself with the flow, the person stops demanding absolute guarantees before acting. At night, when the body should rest but the mind insists on revisiting the day, the phrase can be used as a closing gesture. Repeated slowly, it signals the internal system that it is no longer necessary to monitor, that the day has completed its cycle, which is now possible to release. Even if the problems have not been resolved, there is permission to rest. This simple gesture changes the quality of rest, because sleep stops being an escape and becomes a continuation of the flow. In everyday life, the confidence cultivated in this way does not manifest itself as exaggerated optimism. It appears as sobriety, like the ability to deal with frustrations without internally collapsing, as a willingness to adjust routes without interpreting each change as failure. The phrase helps us remember that life does not require constant rigidity, but adaptable presence. With continued use, something is consolidated, the realization that you don't have to face everything alone, not in the sense of depending on something external, but of recognizing that there is a greater movement in which we are part. This perception changes the attitude towards challenges. Instead of constant resistance, silent cooperation with what presents itself emerges. Thus, the phrase becomes less of a formal practice and more of an internal backdrop, a state of confidence that accompanies, sustains, and goes through the day. And when that happens, life doesn't become predictable, but it becomes livable, even in the midst of uncertainty. In the end, what this phrase offers is not a technique but a change of attitude towards life. It does not promise to control what comes ahead, nor does it eliminate the unpredictability that is part of existing. What it does is return something essential that was lost along the way, the ability to walk without being in constant war with what is. When confidence returns as an internal state, life does not become easier in a superficial sense. Challenges keep arising, losses keep happening, doubts keep visiting the mind. The difference is in the way all of this is crossed. There is less rigidity, less unnecessary tension, less effort to support internal characters who need to manage everything all the time. A more honest relationship with one's own limitations emerges and, interestingly, that is where strength appears. The phrase kami no manamani does not replace decisions, does not resolve conflicts for you, and does not guarantee specific results. It just repositions the center. Instead of living reacting to the fear of what might happen, you begin to respond from a broader place, where the present is enough to take the next step. This repositioning silently changes the quality of everyday life, because it reduces the internal friction that consumes so much energy without us realizing it. Over time, trust stops being a conscious effort and becomes a background, a discrete feeling that it is possible to continue even without absolute certainty, that you don't need to understand everything to be at peace, that there is a greater rhythm operating, regardless of the mental narratives that try to predict or control every detail. This rhythm is not something external that needs to be achieved, but something you can align yourself with over and over again whenever you get lost. Perhaps this is the most important point. Trust is not a permanent state, but a constant return. You move away, you contract, you get lost in thoughts and fears, and then returns. Return to breathing. Return to the body. Return to the sentence. Each return is a simple gesture of agreement with life, with how she presents herself at that moment, without demanding that it be different, so that you can rest. If something in you recognize this path, allow yourself to continue exploring, not as an anxious search, but as a patient listening. If this idea resonates with you, it is a sign that something inside has already begun to reorganize itself, even if it is not yet clear. Sometimes the transformation begins exactly like that, without fanfare, without proof, just as an almost imperceptible internal shift. If you want to continue walking with us through this silent territory between the visible and the invisible, subscribe to the channel and allow these reflections to accompany your days. Here, the invitation is not to believe, but to feel, experience, and remember. And perhaps the question remains, echoing softly, without demanding an immediate answer. What if what you call destiny is not a force that pushes from outside, but a subtle movement? What comes when you finally stop resisting and start walking in harmony with what has always been supporting your steps?